Mr. Chairman, according to U.S. term limits, approximately 82% of American citizens support congressional term limits. This includes 76% of Democrats, 89% of Republicans, and 83% of independents. The turnover rate for the House incumbents who attempt re-election typically is below 10%. Many voters believe that once in Washington, D.C., incumbents become permanent fixtures who are less responsive to the needs of their constituents. During the 117th Congress, the average length of service for members of the House was 8.9 years, or 4.5 House terms. And the average length of the service members of the Senate was 11 years, or 1.8 Senate terms. This proposed constitutional amendment, H.J. Res. 11, would establish limits of 3 terms for members of the House and 2 terms for members of the Senate. Congressional term limits are designed to restore competitiveness in the election process. Each House member, for instance, receives nearly $1 million per year for franked or free mail, staff salaries, and office and travel expenses. While campaigning, incumbents continue to receive their salaries of approximately $174,000 a year, which typically dwarfs the income of challengers who often must resign from their jobs while running for office. Congressional term limits will break the alignment between members of Congress and the special interest groups that support their campaigns. Americans deserve members of Congress who will work for them, who are not bought and paid for by special interest or political parties. This proposed constitutional amendment would put an end to seeing career politicians in Congress and return this body to its representative intention of a citizen legislature. I urge support of this proposed constitutional amendment, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman, to begin with, I'd like to point out that we already have term limits set forth in the Constitution. They're called elections. I've long opposed artificial term limits for members of Congress because such term limits are fundamentally undemocratic by placing an unjustified limit on voters' preferences for candidates. While I can understand the superficial appeal of term limits, it is up to voters to determine who gets to represent them and for how long. Term limits would also lead to an inexperienced revolving door Congress that is even more susceptible to political brinkmanship and short-term thinking at the expense of long-term policy solutions. A lack of institutional knowledge and expertise resulting from inexperienced legislators would leave Congress dependent on and at the mercy of outside forces, including corporate lobbyists and the other 2 branches of government. Also, there is a risk that, as members approach the end of their final terms, they might feel less accountability to their constituents because they would no longer face the prospect of defeat at the polls. Instead, they are far more likely to focus on what will help them land their next job than on the job they actually have, serving their district. If you have concerns about the revolving door between Congress and K Street now, just wait until members are forced to find new employment after 6 years. Mr. Chairman, opposition to term limits is not a partisan issue. Indeed, at a hearing before the Constitution Subcommittee last week, 2 of our Republican colleagues spoke at length and with great eloquence in opposition to congressional term limits. While they couch their opposition to such term limits in an anti-regulatory frame that I do not agree with, I do agree with their broader point about the dangers of congressional term limits to democracy and to our republic. They spoke of the diminishment of voters' rights, the loss of institutional knowledge and expertise, the lack of accountability at the end of a member's tenure, and the general weakening of the people's house, making them susceptible to manipulation by others that would result from term limits. I could not agree more. And given the bipartisan opposition to this resolution, given the wildly low chance this amendment will find the support it needs for enactment, one might ask why we are moving it at all. Could it be because its sponsor, the gentleman from South Carolina, has threatened to oppose various spending measures as House Republicans barrel toward a shutdown? Whatever the motives here, term limits are antithetical to our longstanding belief in democratic Republican government. By taking the decision-making power away from the voters and undermining the power and effectiveness of the people's representatives, imposing congressional term limits would be a grave disservice to the American people. Therefore, I strongly oppose H.J. Res. 11. I urge all of my colleagues to vote against it, and I yield back.
Entirely opposed to H.J. Res. 11 and the notion of placing term limits on members of Congress. I understand the frustration not only of members of Congress, but of our constituents. We are all tired of career politicians making promises every 2 years, then failing to deliver and blaming someone else or something else for that failure. This policy, however, is misguided, misidentifies the source of the problem, and provides the wrong remedy. The real threat to the rights and liberties of the American people isn't found in our ability to vote for our representatives, but in the exponential growth of the unelected, unmovable, and unaccountable federal bureaucracy that has exploded in size and power over the last several decades. These bureaucrats, who are nearly impossible to remove and are encouraged to become career officials through benefits like pensions, have been allowed to burrow into the undergrowth in D.C., yet have never been vetted, interviewed, or approved by the American people. In other words, they have never received a single vote, yet wield massive amounts of power. These officials make policies without being held accountable to any particular geographical or philosophical constituency, and are never held responsible if they do something which goes against the needs of the American people, which they routinely and intentionally do. Unlike members of this body, if we do something wrong or something which our constituents do not agree, we can be voted out of office. This is in and of itself a term limit of time served. The founders clearly established the primacy of the legislative authority through the long list of enumerated and implied powers granted to Congress as compared to the brevity of the powers granted to the executive branch in Article 2. The framers of the Constitution, when debating congressional qualifications, actually discussed term limits because of their inclusion in the Articles of Confederation. After such debate, however, they were dropped during the convention process. Today, bureaucrats often serve in the same agency for their entire professional career. These same officials gain subject matter expertise and institutional knowledge, all the while having been delegated more and more authority by this very body. As a freshman member, I am aware of how different D.C. is. Our body is unlike anything in the private sector. Getting to know the ins and outs of the federal bureaucracy, let alone getting a handle on the copious amounts of rules and regulations it pushes out, is even more difficult. Limiting a House member to 6 or 8 or 10 or even 12 years risks creating a body that is unprepared to legislate, let alone hold administrative officials accountable, something our constituents are expecting us to do. Such an approach will actually make our elected representatives less accountable, not more. Is Washington, D.C. broken? Absolutely. The odds are stacked against the American people in a government which has grown too big and too powerful to control and instead now controls us. But undermining and weakening the only branch of government that is directly elected by the American people is the wrong approach. As I mentioned, I understand the frustration that is at the heart of my colleague's proposed constitutional amendment. I'm willing to work with him and anyone who supports changing the way D.C. operates by working on legislation that properly identifies and targets the source of the problems we face and prescribes an actual remedy. This could come in the form of term limits for bureaucrats or other measures to ensure accountability and oversight over these unelected officials. I am working on legislation to term limit bureaucrats and would invite all of my colleagues to join me. Reform is necessary, and it should come from the people who are actually elected by the American people. The only directly elected officials in town should not become the target. It should be those who are unaccountable. I want to close by reiterating that term limits already exist through elections. The founders laid out what the qualifications are for running for office. But it is also imperative that members of Congress reclaim their rightful place of legislating, take such power back from the unelected bureaucrats, hold themselves accountable by taking difficult but important votes that would put this country back on track, rather than always blaming someone else, including the very bureaucrats and agencies that this body has empowered. This Congress needs to unify so that we can hold accountable those officials, federal employees and agencies who act in the best interests of themselves and special interests rather than in the best interests of the United States of America. I urge a no vote on H.J. Res. 11, and with that, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join in opposition to this bill. I used to work for Senator Paul Sarbanes when he was the senior member of the Senate in Maryland. And he told me one time that he'd gone on a trip to South Carolina. And while he was going around, he saw a billboard that said, vote for Strom Thurmond. He's been fighting for term limits since before you were born. The irony I want to point out on this is that many of the advocates for term limits have served much longer than the number of terms that they're advocating for, or in this instance, pushing a statute to set. I disagree with the concept of term limits for members of Congress and most legislative bodies, I think for the reasons that have already been stated. But I will say this, to my colleagues who vote to support this legislation, if you've served 3 terms or more, I think you've got some explaining to do, because one obvious way we could have term limits is for people to leave after they've served 3 terms. So if you feel that strongly about it, I think you should exercise that right. My predecessor was Anthony Brown. He served 3 terms, and he ran for another office. He was successful. But he didn't make this a 20-year, 30-year thing, and you don't have to. Nobody requires you to stay here after you get elected, and I'm sure if you decide to step down and not run again, the voters will move on. So please, if you want to do it, feel free. But let's not impose a statute or a constitutional effort here that requires people to step down, even though their voters think they should stay, even though they want to stay, and even though they're doing a good job. And with that,
Ranking Member Nadler asked a question I can definitely answer. His question is, why are we debating term limits today? And he correctly points out, we're debating term limits today, even though I'm not sure our measure will pass, and there are Republicans who will join in opposition to term limits. I think I can peel back the curtain a bit. In January, during the speaker contest, there were a group of us who wanted to change the way Washington, D.C. operates. That meant changing the spending, that meant advancing balanced budgets, that meant getting House conservatives on committees of great import, but it also meant taking a vote on term limits. We required it. Speaker McCarthy agreed to it. For the last 8 months, he's been in breach of that agreement. And just weeks ago, I took to the floor of the House to serve notice of that breach, to inform Speaker McCarthy that if he did not hold a vote on term limits, which we will have today, that he would face a motion to vacate. Well, it seems that those remarks may have animated Speaker McCarthy, because here we are taking this vote. And while I acknowledge it may not pass, what even the opponents of term limits must acknowledge is that term limits are wildly popular in every zip code in America except 202, the Washington, D.C. zip code. You go to almost any place in the country, throw a rock on Main Street. Chances are 8 and 10, it's going to hit somebody who's in favor of term limits. But politicians aren't. I want to address some of the reasons why I think term limits would give us better government. And I'm one of the members here who served in both systems. And I will acknowledge that both systems have benefits and drawbacks. But in a term limits environment, you get more fresh ideas. Far too often in Washington, D.C., we revert to a failed and often corrupt muscle memory on how to do things, because you got a lot of people here who've been doing them for 10, 20 years, sometimes even longer. So people who are not beholden to the Washington way of thinking will naturally have a more dynamic manner in which to come up with fresh ideas. Second, I think it creates a stronger connection to the district. If the district is generating a new person every 6 years, then you don't have people who move to Washington, who make their lives in Washington. It becomes temporary, more like the true intent of our founders. And third, I'll use a sports analogy. I don't think anybody would ever like to watch a basketball game without a shot clock. You'd see people just dribbling around, holding the ball, never making a move, never having to present aggressive defense. And that kind of feels like how we've been governing for the last several decades. We just govern by omnibus bill and continuing resolution. And so if you have a shot clock, if you know that you get 6 years in the House, may go on to the Senate for a little bit more public service, but 6 years in the House, that's going to force people to actually compromise more, to take half a loaf. And by the way, I know that having been in that system. When I was in the state legislature, if there was an issue I cared a lot about, maybe animal welfare, cannabis reform, I would be willing to take less than what was perfect, because I knew I only had a certain amount of time there to contribute to that process, and I wanted to make, I wanted to be directionally correct in terms of the policies of our state. Here, increasingly, you have some of these folks who've seemingly been around since dirt was young, and it doesn't unlock that sense of urgency that oftentimes can lead to more productive government. there is a reason most of our states have term limits. It's because most of the people want it. And in states that have term limits, you have higher frequency of balanced budget. I think you don't have the endemic corruption that we often see in Washington, D.C., and you're not as lashed to the special interests. Like, you know, in a term limits environment, the special interests and lobbyists can't really buy a lawmaker. They can only rent them for 6 years. And then they have to re-engage that process. And it kind of makes it tougher on the corrupt lobbyists and special interests. But in our system, they buy the cow and spend the rest of their time getting the milk for free. And that might be the reason why we're seeing such opposition to term limits now. I believe we can have open, honest, transparent government, and we will have this vote, not because it's a comfortable thing for a lot of people to take it, because people are going to be taking a vote that is on the opposite side of like 80% of the country when they vote against this.
Will
But at
the
least
gentleman
we'll be able
yield?
to have that vote. Sure, I'll yield, Mr. Ivey.
How many terms have you served?
Oh yeah, I'll get to that. I served 3 terms, but here's the deal. A lot of us who've served that amount of time, we actually want to shorten our own sentence, but we don't think our district should have to unilaterally disarm. Right? I think that, tell you what, if we can get universal term limits,
will the gentleman yield?
Well, I'm afraid I'm out of time, but I'd love to continue the conversation.
There's nobody else in your district who's capable of serving in
Many more,
Congress after
probably
you?
far more capable than me. The voters did send me here to the tune of 70% of the vote, but I do think that if everyone had the same standard, we all live, I mean, like, you can't really be advocating for us living by different rules in different districts. Let's just all live by the same rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We all know that term limits exist with the voter. You're on the ballot, and the voters have a choice. And if you have this artificial term limit put in, then the voters, the only person they don't have a choice in choosing is the person with the most experience and a record of where they've been on issues, which the people who want to know about. That's the person who they wouldn't have an opportunity to vote for. This is maybe wildly popular, some people say. Well, people who get 70% of the vote or people that get 86% of the vote are wildly popular. The public in my district is not clamoring for term limits. I've had people come up to me over the years and tell me, never retire, don't you ever quit. They support me because I'm responsive, I know the issues, I stand up for my district, and I'm not beholden to lobbyists. To suggest that everybody in this Congress is beholden to lobbyists and they're rented and they're bought is wrong. Most of the people in this House of Representatives are good, honest, hardworking people. We may have a disagreement on our positions on issues. We may have a different constituency that we need to represent. But most, I would say 90% of the people here are scrupulously honest, hardworking, and care about their jobs. And to suggest that they're rented or they're bought is a wrong statement to make, and it besmirches this entire body. But then people who want to shut down the government and who didn't want the election to be carried out, the Electoral College, and tried to work with the previous president to get around democracy and to trample on it and to try to take over the Senate and hang Mike Pence were the kind of people that could easily come out and say they're for term limits because it sounds good and they're just trying to get the people on their side when they're not on the people's side. So this proposal, which has been around for a long time, it's a constitutional amendment, we shouldn't be, I wondered why we were voting on it. It made no sense, but if this is part of the ransom that was held by the 15 or 20 people who are holding this country hostage right now by not agreeing to have a continuing resolution that will pay the military, that will pay your individuals at TSA who will have to work but not get paid, who will pay your federal employees who have to work but won't get paid. People work paycheck to paycheck, a lot of people. They're going to have to work essential services, but they won't have any money to pay for their bills, their children's bills, their school bills, and the folks who are shutting down the government don't care about them. They may claim they care about them, but they don't care about them in practice because they're saying work and don't get paid, while we stand up here and claim we're fighting for a balanced budget, or we're caring about how much money's in government. And the money they're against in government is the money that goes to the poor kids who don't have parents that can afford to give them food that they need in schools, food to sustenance during the day, that need help in education because they have disabilities. They don't care about those people. They want to cut those programs. They want to cut housing for the poor. Those programs they want to cut. But for the military and for taxes, where the rich get the best deal, they don't want to change that at all. So don't be misled by those people. Remember, this is going to be a Republican shutdown. They're going to shut it down. They're going to ask you to work. They're going to tell you to work, and they're not going to pay you. That's wrong. We need to be working not on this hooey legislation, just like the hooey that worked for next door on impeachment of Joe Biden. A man having no basis to impeach whatsoever because they even admit, and their chief witness admits, there's no proof whatsoever he did anything wrong. We've got another bill on this calendar about saying any federal president that's indicted has to be tried in federal court. This used to be the people's house. Now it's Trump's house. Let's put all the president's criminal behavior, and there hasn't been many presidents with criminal charges, let's have them tried in federal court so their appeals go to their Supreme Court so that they have a different jury pool to pick for. If they violate the laws of Georgia, they should be tried in Georgia. If they violate the laws of New York, they should be tried in New York. And there's nothing in our Constitution that says you can do such a bill. The Constitution spells out which cases go to federal court, and it's not the cases of your president who selects only the best people and who never lies and who never makes a mistake, quote unquote. It's not for them to have all their cases tried in federal court. That's unconstitutional too. This is hooey. Next door was hooey. What's going on the floor is hooey. There's a lot of hooey, too much hooey to go around. I yield back.
My amendment is very clear and simple. It's an amendment to HJ Resolution 11 that would simply increase the number of terms for House members from 3 terms to 6 terms. 3 to 6. And I have a great deal of love and respect for my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, but I agree with him. I agree, we need term limits, no question. But I believe there are several issues with the underlying resolution, and I think 6 years for a member of the House, I think it's insufficient. And I say that because I don't believe we have any members in our conference that serve as chairs of our committees that have under 10 years. Matter of fact, I don't believe we have a freshman, sophomore, or junior in our conference that serves maybe even as a subcommittee chair under the A committees. So my point is that I've been up here, 33 months. I guess I could say I'm still trying to navigate these treacherous waters up here, trying to find a safe lily pad to land on every once in a while, but we're continuing to learn. I guess you could say maybe a little wet behind the ears yet, trying to figure out how to deal with this swamp that we call Washington, D.C. So the idea that after 3 terms we're out the door, I think many members would probably say many of us don't have that skill set and that historical knowledge to manage some of our more complicated committees here, but I believe 12 years would be appropriate. By limiting the service in the House to 3 terms and service in the Senate to 2 terms, we are inherently saying that the House's work is less important than that of our Senate colleagues. With members in the House for only 6 years compared to staff, and we got staff up here that have been here for decades, we would be leaving the country, quite honestly, to be run by those who have not been elected. There are other questions. How will committee chairs be determined with such little experience? How about the speaker and leadership roles? I think these are some questions that we have to ask ourselves. Therefore, I encourage my colleagues to vote for this amendment, which will limit the number of qualifying terms for House members to 6 terms in order to make it consistent with our center counterparts. 3 terms is not enough. I want to be very, very clear. I support term limits. We're just going to disagree as to exactly how long a member of the House should serve. And with that,
I'm opposed to this amendment because it does not fix the fundamental flaw with the bill. Term limits of any sort, aside from the term limits imposed by elections, by the Constitution, are contrary to the obvious, contrary to the will of the framers. First of all, you need a constitutional amendment to do it. But second of all, as was stated before, term limits, I don't care whether you make it at 6 years or 12 years, are going to transfer power to the staff. against the unelected, as opposed to the elected members of the House and Senate. And second of all, it will lead to members looking for their next job and possibly bending on various legislative matters with a look toward employment as a lobbyist or for some interest group, and that's exactly what we don't need. So it happens already, but this would greatly increase it. So I oppose the amendment as I do the bill.
Support Mr. Nail's amendment. I'm here in my 6th term, and I'm just now figuring out how the Rules Committee works. And if you don't know how the Rules Committee works, you don't know a lot about how this place works. And I'm not even going to claim to understand how it works half as well as the staff who work on the Rules Committee know how it works. So anybody who thinks in 3 terms you can figure out how this place works is still in the dark, frankly. And so I think the gentleman's point about putting the Senate on a stronger footing than the House is also a concern. Why should they serve for longer than House members serve? I think that's dangerous. We're looking to get jammed by the Senate here any day now by their spending bills, even though the spending and tax authority should originate in the House, as the Constitution says. But you may not know that if you've only been here 3 terms. Another point is you could be here 3 terms and never be in the majority, never really have any say. And because in the House, if you're in the minority, it's not like the Senate. You're not that relevant. It's a lot easier because the reporters don't even care what you have to say. They don't show up outside the conference after every meeting if you're in the minority. So I think it's a good idea to extend it to 6 terms, and for this and
Would the
other
gentleman
reasons.
yield?
I will yield to the ranking member.
Well, thank you. I think you just said that you've been here 6 terms and are just learning how the Rules Committee operates. Under the Nels Amendment, you would be out before completely learning how the Rules Committee operates. So the Nels Amendment is not an improvement on the bill itself.
If reclaiming my time, if the ranking member would like to modify Nell's amendment to change 6 terms to 8 terms.
No, I would oppose the amendment as I will
support
oppose
that
the
as
bill.
well. And I have supported bills, term limit bills that have 6 terms for the House. And so just to be consistent and just based on my own experience and just not to be a hypocrite, I'm going to support Mr. Nail's amendment.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. I do agree with Ranking Member Nadler that I would oppose the amendment because I don't think it improves the fundamental flaws of the underlying bill. As members on both sides of the aisle have pointed out, our Constitution already has a mechanism for term limits. It's called voting. Every 2 years in the House, every 6 years in the Senate. And that comports with what our founders intended. They explicitly discussed this issue, and the Supreme Court in U.S. Term Limits, Inc. versus Thornton said that in the United States representative democracy, people should be able to choose whom they please to govern. And that's at bottom line what we're talking about here. We've all seen in this Congress, for example, that there are some people who, after decades of service, still have very much to contribute, both in institutional knowledge, in fidelity to public service, and we've seen those who have just been elected who never should have been here in the first place and probably should be removed. So the voters should have the absolute say, and what we would do best under these circumstances is to empower an engaged electorate, to make it easier, not harder, for eligible persons to vote, to remove the influence of dark money in our elections. You know, that is where I think we should be focusing our attention. I do want to thank the gentleman from Florida for making clear the origin of this amendment. He said it is wildly popular in the polls. And that is what we are seeing this week. Last week in Congress, we are voting on things that are wildly popular in certain polls, rather than on actually doing the hard work to fund the government, which requires people to work together, across the Senate, across the House, across the aisle, rather than migrating to the most extreme elements in the chaos caucus. So with that, I would
I want to thank the chairman for yielding. I moved to strike the last word. This is a really important discussion, and it's one that's long overdue. I got to Congress, Mr. Gates and I came in together in the same class. We've been here, we're on our 4th term. We have filed term limits bills ever since we got here. I think, if my memory is correct, I think the first bill that I sponsored or co-sponsored was a term limits bill. But we have never had a hearing, so far as I know, in the modern era on the subject, at least not so long as I've been involved. And so this is a day that's a long time coming. It's an important conversation. Some important points have been made here. And I appreciate Mr. Nell's amendment that in his mind, the best case scenario, for at least for the House, would be 6 terms as opposed to 3, as the current bill stands. I have to confess, I'm not exactly sure what the magic number is, but I do believe the principle is the right one. And I think this is a healthy debate. I'm under no illusion, like Mr. Gates said, that this is going to pass and become law anytime soon, but I think it's something we need to talk about and duly consider, and here's why. Because we all know that we're living in unprecedented times. We're only 247 years into this grand experiment in self-governance. And as a constitutional law attorney, I spent my career there before I came to Congress, I think a lot about what the founders intended. One thing we all should agree on, what they certainly intended, was that this body, which we've become the greatest legislative body in arguably in the history of the world, that it would be composed of citizen legislators, not professional politicians, career politicians, that people in their era, in their mind, you would have people from broad walks, different walks of life, different skill sets, sets of experiences, life experiences. They would bring different levels of acumen to the table, but they would all have things to contribute. And they would come to Washington and serve for a period of years, and then they would go back to their real life. They would go back to the blacksmith shop or the farm or the law practice or whatever. That has become an idea of the past, and I think it's hurt the institution. If you look at the polling right now across the country, I mean, we have record low approval levels of Congress, and also all of our institutions of government. Right now, we could all agree, you go home, if you did town halls and over the district work period, you probably heard a lot of what I've heard. We can't trust government. We can't trust any institution of government. Part of which, since we're here in the Judiciary Committee, and this is under our jurisdiction, part of the reason for that, the big problem, is the weaponization and politicization of the Department of Justice, by the way, that, you know, there's a 2-tiered system of justice, and they see special treatment for the mighty and the powerful like the Biden family, and overly aggressive prosecution of the president's political opponent, Mr. Trump, by way of one glaring example. We're having a hearing simultaneously on oversight about the staggering level of corruption and then cover-up of Hunter Biden and the Biden families profiting off their office and their family brand. All that is to say that the only way, these are desperate times, and desperate times call for desperate measures, and if we're going to restore the people's trust in the institution of Congress and in government itself, maybe the time has come for term limits. I certainly think it has. Let me read you one quick synopsis. There was an article from the Heritage Foundation in 1994. This idea has been bandied around about. They say, skepticism about and distaste for long-term political careerism are central to the American experience. Term limits were contained in America's first governing document, by the way, we forget, the Articles of Confederation. They do not appear in the Constitution. Why? Primarily because its drafters saw them as, quote, entering into too much detail for a short document. It wasn't that they were opposed to it. They were trying to keep the Constitution concise. Several modern presidents have supported congressional term limits, and since the Constitution was amended in 1951 to limit presidents to 2 terms, many political scientists have observed that congressional term limits could cure the imbalance between these 2 branches of the federal government. The American people are in favor of the concept, and here's why in short summary. It prevents people in power from becoming too powerful. That's the beauty of our republic and representative government, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and their duly elected representatives, and also it better reflects the will of the people, because then you do allow them to bring in new people, new ideas, fresh ideas. I also served in my state legislature. We had term limits in Louisiana, and I think it serves the body well. And you've seen a revolving group of leaders and people come in, and fresh faces and new ideas, and I think that's healthy. I think it's good. And at the end of the day, I think ultimately it will help us restore trust in this institution. And to me, that is a root problem that we all need to be working on. So for all those reasons, I'm still thinking about the 6 terms, Mr. Nels, but I appreciate you lending that to the discussion, and I think through this process we'll come with the right number.
I rise in opposition to HJ 11, and I also rise in opposition to this amendment for the repeated notion that we are talking about a possible constitutional amendment. It should not be done lightly or frivolously. Although I want to compliment Mr. Nels for offering this amendment because it does at least even up that lopsided nature of the original bill, which would have members of the House out in 6 years and members of the Senate out in 12. So I applaud that part of it, but I still am opposed to all of this for very simple reasons. We are term limited in multiple ways. Number one, some of the gentlemen who are speaking here in favor of term limits and in favor of whether 3 or 6 in the House are beyond that. They could self-term limit. They could not run for election again. Stand up, be that independent soul that says you're right. We need fresh ideas in here, fresh blood, self-term limit. Number two, we're term limited by our voters. We stand for elections. Our voters decide. It is their choice who is going to be their closest representative, their closest federal representative. So voters, I don't want to take that choice away from voters. Now I recognize that there are some states that have terribly gerrymandered districts, so some voters really don't get a say. They're given a representative and they're told who it's going to be. So we need to fix gerrymandering. We need to fix dark money in elections. I was thinking about it. We can all think about a few members who we think should not be here, wish they were term limited out, but think about those who were not term limited out. Would we have wanted John Lewis to have left in 6 years? Would we have wanted Elijah Cummings to stop giving to this body, to this country? Both of those men, their spirit of service, of ethics, of equity, their wisdom and their passion for the Constitution, the rule of law, and this country, their love of country. And for those who just said on the other side, citizens keep railing that they can't trust government, they can't trust the institutions. Strange, it's those very members who say that over and over again, who use the MO of a former president to tear down our independent institutions. Whether it is our electoral process. They tried right up to the election, and then, of course, after the election, to tear down faith in our free and fair elections. Wrongly. The Department of Justice, tear down our faith in an independent Department of Justice. How about the news media? Those who would say the news media is not an independent institution valuable to this country, but would call it the enemy of the state, the crooked media. If people are worried about the tearing down of our faith in independent institutions, stop doing it yourself. Finally, we're here at a week where we're about to shut this government down. Actually, we're not going to shut this government down. Through the malpractice of those on the other side, whether they are here for 1 term or 10, this government will likely shut down, hurting the American people. If you're getting at the problem of members of Congress, this false notion of a constitutional amendment is frivolous. You know it. Let's not shut this government down. Let's
yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nails.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany. We just heard Ms. Dean say, and I think, quote, we're term limited by our voters. I think Ms. Scanlon said something, I'm paraphrasing, that we have elections and we should let the voters decide. One thing that we do know is that well over 90% of the incumbents that are up for re-election, they get re-elected. They get re-elected over and over and over again. And I know that this administration has a very poor approval rating, but the approval rating of Congress is lower than whale feces. And we continue to get reelected. And why is that? It's about the money. Everybody's out there working with the special interest groups. They're getting the big fat cats to support them. You have millions of dollars in your campaign reelection accounts. And how do you expect somebody to compete with that? An approval rating most of the time in the single digits. and we keep getting reelected over and over and over again. It just doesn't make sense to me. But what it is because of all the special interests and all the money that these incumbents that we're receiving up here, it's very, very hard to change direction with such a dismal record. So again, yeah, let the voters decide, but really, is it really the voters decide when you have so much money in your account to go out there and spread a message? And it's uncalled for. We need to have some term limits. We need to keep it to 12 years because it will give us some time to get our feet up underneath us and try to manage this very difficult, swampy area of Washington, D.C.
Chairman, some may be surprised that Hank Johnson is in favor of term limits, but not for myself. Only for United States Supreme Court justices, and for the very reasons that my good friend Mr. Gates talked about. I mean, it's an opportunity when you, because we don't have lifetime tenure like Supreme Court justices do. We are term limited. We serve at the will of the voters. Every 2 years, we come up for a referendum on whether or not we come back, and I respect the intelligence and the intellect of the voters for making decisions to send us back, while I do admit that there is too much dark money in the process. And that dark money, by the way, was unleashed by a lifetime tenured United States Supreme Court. That's why my friend Representative Schiff and I, along with other members of this body, last week filed the Term Act, which would establish term limits for Supreme Court justices, because they are the ones who now are existing based on the corrupt lobbyist and special interest spending that is done on them, taking luxury vacations, flying around on private jets, getting your mama's house paid for by a billionaire, and then your mama staying rent-free for the last 10 years in the house, getting your sons or your godsons or nephews tuition at a private swank school paid by a billionaire, the purchase of a luxury recreational vehicle, which would never be seen in a Walmart parking lot, by the way. All of these things brought and paid for by special interest who have infected the United States Supreme Court now. So I agree that term limits are necessary to make sure that there are fresh ideas always coming onto the court, as opposed to folks parading around as originalists when it suits them. Also, term limits provide a stronger connection to the people, accountability, in other words. We have a Supreme Court that is unaccountable, no connection to the people, not anybody hanging out in a Walmart parking lot, just somebody perpetrating that they are. They're so far removed, going to luxury, all-male meetings. You know, I mean, it's just pathetic. Endemic corruption has taken hold on the United States Supreme Court. That's why we need term limits there. But I agree with Mr. Massey. You know, after 6 terms, you're kind of just getting your feet wet, and you're starting to understand how this place operates. Now, I believe that our citizens should always have the ability to bring us home if they think that we're doing a bad job. But if they feel like they're being represented, we need to have the ability of the will of the citizens to be recognized and deferred to. So I rise in opposition to the underlying bill as well as the amendment, and with that I want to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Swalwell.
I do find it comical that there's a conversation among my MAGA colleagues that they would be interested in leaving this job through a term limit, because for the last 6+ years, with Donald Trump in the political ether, I've seen them make a number of decisions where they put their job over the country, where it appears to me that there's a fear that you couldn't get another job because you're afraid of doing the right thing and then being primaried and losing your job. And I'm not just saying that because that's the hot take that I have. That's what you all tell us privately. We've talked to you, and you've told us, I don't like what Donald Trump did with Russia. I don't like how close he is with Putin. I don't like that he tried to burn down the Capitol and made us all run for our own safety. But I can't say that because I'm going to get primaried at home. So I don't see a lot over there that actually would be willing to leave this job. You do everything to keep this job. You put the country at risk to keep this job. So this is nonsense that you would even be willing to put a term limit on yourself, because all you have to do is the right thing, and then you'd show us that you're serious.
Chairman, I think Mr. Swalwell was agreeing with the opposition to term limits while being a little more disagreeable than we all should be, and I regret that.
Sorry about that, Darrell.
Well, I regret it because, in fact, this is an incredibly serious discussion. Mr. Swalwell and I both come from California. We had an experiment in term limits, and although it still exists, it had to be modified, and had to be modified because we had no expertise and because the revolving door became an epidemic. When you only had 6 years, and the same will probably be true in 12, you're always looking for that next job. You're looking for the next thing in your career, so if you can't jump to this, you jump to that. So if you look at our members of the Assembly for the entire period of the 6-year term limit, what we find is we find people who are everywhere in government or in lobbying, and the Assembly was simply one of the steps they took. Now, having said that, I have a different reason for opposing the underlying bill and the amendment. And it's not because I didn't willingly leave here after 9 terms. It's because I served with people like Henry Hyde, Nancy Pelosi, Jane Harman, the list on either side, Don Young. I've served with men and women of the House, with people who made a decision to remain here for all the right reasons. I may have disagreed with some of them on one side or the other. Heck, I disagree with some in my own party from time to time. But they were institutional. I served with John Dingell, and as a freshman with John Dingell, the longest-serving member on the Democrat side, and Don Young, longest-serving member on the Republican side, I had the honor to serve with both of them. Their institutional memory as part of the collective has a value that you cannot replace if you give it away through this amendment, either of the amendments, the underlying bill or this. And I would say this, those who study, those who are here for a short time, and those who are here for a long time, all know that the average length of time that somebody is in the House is about 6 years, some less and many more. But the many more every 10 years face a redistricting in most cases, face other challenges. Many of the members that I lament losing, like Howard Berman, lost to one of his own members in a redistricting, and I miss him. And if he were still here on this committee, we would have a wonderful piece of institutional memory and somebody who knew how to work on his side when appropriate and across the aisle when appropriate. So I'm speaking as someone who left the House, has only been back here, I'm only in my 2nd term back here, someone who's given an exemption in this thing that effectively goes past my natural and desired retirement. I'm speaking because I don't want to lose that institutional memory. I know the value of it. And for those who talk about extremists on either side of the aisle, they are very, very often members who have not been here that long. And many, many members over time realize that the vast majority of legislation that ever becomes law is bipartisan. It does the necessary compromise. And that compromise is not for corporate America. That compromise is for the American people. So I know I haven't given you anything other than I'm the old guy who's been here a long time and I'm sitting at the top of the dais. But I will tell you this. I've seen the damage. My fellow Californians have seen the damage. And it is not the right thing to have a revolving door for every member. Plenty of our members leave too soon. But those who stay, like Don Young, like Henry Hyde, like Nancy Pelosi, and yes, like the late John Dingell, they add to this institution in a way you cannot add through staffing. And with that, I thank all of you.
Chairman, as one old guy to another, I'd like to associate myself with Chairman Issa's remarks there. Let me say this. I do think that opposition, regardless of whether it's 6 years or 12 years, is the only way to go on this issue. And a couple of reasons have already been stated. I've stated some already, but just a couple of quick points. One is, as a former staffer on the Hill, I'd like to just put that perspective on there too, because one of the things that is important is we don't want to have the staff running the show here. And having staff with outstanding talent, institutional knowledge, and the like is important. It's great to have people you can turn to for that. But I think it's important to understand that if you're turning everybody out in 6 years or 12 years, you're not going to have, as Chairman Issa was just saying a moment ago, members who've been here long enough to develop that expertise themselves. And so what you're going to be left with is people turning to the staff to help basically run the show. The other piece of that too that's also problematic, and I'm a former lobbyist as well, and so one of the things that happens with staff who've stayed a long time and then leave is they go become lobbyists. Now, if you don't have members who've been here long enough to have, develop that kind of deep institutional knowledge themselves, the other source they're going to turn to is the lobbying community. And I don't know really anybody, I could be wrong, but my friends on the other side of the aisle over there, I don't know any of you all think that that's a great way to go. We don't necessarily want to have people who've been here for such little amounts of time that the lobbyists and the staffs are the place they have to turn to actually get that kind of information, as opposed to colleagues who've been here, as Chairman Issa mentioned, 20, 30 years themselves. And then one last quick point, and I'll yield back. I mentioned a moment ago that my predecessor stayed here for 6 years and then left. Previously, I'd been state's attorney in Prince George's County. I was twice elected, wasn't opposed in the second race, but decided not to run for a third term because I thought it was right for me to move on and that it would be a good thing to have, other people have a chance to run for the seat. So I voluntarily decided not to run again. To my colleagues here who are really pushing the term limits issue, I just want to say that the House of Representatives is not Hotel California. The fact that you got here elected here doesn't mean you've got to stay here. And if you think it's better for the institution that people should be leaving in 6 years or 12 years or whatever it is, by all means, I'll come to the going away party. We'll, wish you the best. You can go lobby on K Street or whatever you want to do next. But imposing that through a constitutional amendment, I think is the wrong way to go. And one last point, I forget who, somebody said that 90% of the people who run for re-election get re-elected. And I guess he thought that was a negative thing, but from my perspective, isn't that democracy? Isn't it important for us to say, well, let's let the voters decide, and if the voters decide they want to hang on to this member of Congress for a little bit longer, why not? In my neighboring district is Steny Hoyer. He's been in Congress for over 40 years. He's been an outstanding member of Congress. People like him on both sides of the aisle. I personally think he's been the best majority leader this institution's ever seen. Apparently the voters agree, even with the changes in the lines, as the member mentioned a few minutes ago. He's been able to keep getting reelected decade after decade after decade. I don't think that's a bad thing. So with that, if somebody has, I yield to Chairman Issa.
I appreciate very much your associating with my remarks, but I'm going to come back to something you said that I didn't say that you alluded to. There were Republicans here and Democrats here who have been in the majority, minority, and majority. And it's an oddity that Steny Hoyer and Congresswoman Pelosi, and quite frankly, our team on our side, those speakers, Speaker McCarthy and Speaker Pelosi, they were at the top. We lost the majority, and they, in no small part, were the ones that organized their respective party to retake the majority and then led. And I think, in a sense, if nothing else, this amendment ignores the idea of the leadership that we choose. Almost habitually are those people who can bring us together, and they've learned to do it usually over a number of years. So I think I named a lot of names that were not, chairs, or were chairs but not speaker. Thank you for letting me, reminding me that our leadership is made up of those people that we would lose.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank the chairman. I would like to speak in support of the underlying bill, and I would also like to speak in support of the amendment. I will vote for both, and there are a variety of reasons why. First of all, the Congress is disastrously broken. There is no other way to put it, no matter which side of the aisle you are on, no matter what part of the ideological spectrum you sit. It is disastrously broken. There are a lot of examples I could give, but the 33 trillion examples is probably the best one. It is just an abject failure and has been for my entire life. I'm 51 years old. I am hard-pressed to think of many things that this body has done over those 51 years that are particularly all that productive for the grand scheme of advancing this republic's interest. It's just broken. And I don't know anybody in America across the country, for the most part, who doesn't feel that way. We poll consistently below 20%. Term limits poll consistently above 80%. There's a reason for that. Now, sure, do I think in the abstract and the theory that the best term limit is the voting booth? Yeah, sure. But the problem here is we all get it between gerrymandering for political purposes, gerrymandering and line drawing because of the Voting Rights Act or whatever it is. There are lines that are drawn all over our country that perpetuate parties and members of Congress that consistently stay there. And this idea that expertise is somehow the reason to say, oh, we should just keep staying here in perpetuity, I think is insane. And with all due respect to the point being made about, well, you can just choose to leave Congress, yeah, but that's not the problem. The average age and the average length of time that people serve in Congress is 8.9 years. That's not the problem. The problem isn't that rank and file members don't come and go. The problem is that a handful of octogenarians sit around here and screw this place up repeatedly, indefinitely. They continue to run this place right into the ground. That's the truth. And we just reward it. So I'm going to support this. It's probably not going to pass for whether it gets out of committee and the number of votes that it takes to amend the Constitution of the United States. But I tell you what, one thing we could propose, we don't have to have a constitutional amendment to say that, okay, after 12 years of service, if you love being a representative and bringing your grand expertise to this grand, august body so much, how about you do it for no pay? And how about you do it for no grand position as a chairman or a leader? You just want to come here and share your expertise, great. But why don't we just adopt rules? Doesn't require a constitutional amendment that says if you come here for a 7th term, you will receive no pay, you will not serve as a chairman, and you will not serve in leadership. Great, come here and share all your infinite wisdom. But I think this place needs new blood. I think it does need turnover. And again, there are great members of Congress who have served here terms well past 12 years or well past 6 years. And there are many terrible first-term members of Congress. And I'm sure many think I'm a terrible third-term member of Congress. That's fine. All I'm saying is this place has got to change. And that's what the American people are demanding. And I don't know, if 82% of the American people think, you know what, maybe we ought to limit how long people can sit here and continue to do damage to the United States of America, perhaps perhaps we should listen to them in a representative democracy. And I think that's part of the big problem. We never really listen to the people in this representative democracy. And yes, a republic requires us to make good decisions and figure out how to do it. But in the end, we should try to represent the overall views of the American people. I am pretty confident that a majority of constituents in every state in the union support some form of term limits. And the reason I'm going to agree to the 12-year amendment is because I think it has the best chance of success, a better chance of success, if you will, than 3 terms. And I realize there are some groups out there who might, criticize that, believing that the purity of 3 terms is the best. Well, so be it. This is, in fact, the legislative process at work. I yield back.
I want to start by saying I love this country. I love this democracy. I care deeply about it, not just because I am so honored to be able to represent my state, but also I'm a child of an immigrant family that came here for a better life. And I'm also a former social studies and civics teacher. And I actually have really enjoyed this conversation. It is an important, robust conversation. And I want to say the Republican, Mr. Johnson, said some really interesting things earlier about record low approval for Congress and concerns about trusting government. I share those concerns. I come from a citizen legislature in Vermont. It is incredibly important for us to be rooted in our communities and to constantly be accountable to our constituents back home. And so that, I agree with you. And certainly some of the things that you said, Mr. Roy, it does have to change, absolutely. Where I think we disagree is what are the things that we can do in the near term? And so these conversations are important. This is why we are here. We are supposed to be a deliberative body. But I think we know that this constitutional amendment is not going to go anywhere. But there is actually something that we could do now, which does not take a constitutional amendment. And so I'm sitting here and I'm really trying to be fully present and appreciate the real passion that people have for this topic. But it's difficult to not have this other voice inside of me saying, but I am serving in Congress with a colleague who is a serial fabulist, somebody who lied about just about everything about his history, about his record, about his career in order to get elected. And I think that contributes to this feeling that it's broken, that there's no bottom.
Mr. Chairman, I would raise a point of order. I don't think you can engage in personalities towards Senator Menendez like that.
I've not heard a name mentioned until the gentleman, so I will rule the debate is in order and the gentlelady may continue.
I've been very careful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My point is, we know who I'm talking about. His constituents have said we don't feel represented. Many colleagues have said he is not helping us with our credibility. He is not helping for us to win back the trust of the American people. So why do we spend so much time on things that it's not going to happen when we could do things right now that would rebuild credibility? I have teenagers right now, and I know some folks in this room also have kids they're trying to raise. And I come home on Friday nights and they say, what's the point? What's the point when somebody can be making up all aspects of his career to get elected and to serve, and there's no consequence for that? And I don't have a good answer. And so I wish that we all could do a better job of holding each other and ourselves to higher standards, because that is what is going to help the American people have more trust in the work that we're doing. Again, I do think this is an important conversation. I think it's complicated. But why do we spend so much time on things that are simply about grandstanding and not about actually doing something right now that could help this very, very troubling?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, this is a difficult issue. There are those that would say, and I can relate to that a little bit, that if someone only serves 3 terms, they're going to be just learning, really getting underneath their belt what they need to do and how to operate and how to be independent. And if we're constantly a Congress with new people coming in all the time, that we're going to have an issue of experience. And with that issue of experience, those folks are going to rely upon lobbyists more. They are going to rely on the institutions more, those that are here, the bureaucracy more. And I understand that. So to me, 3 terms is just too short. 6 makes more sense. Quite frankly, I will vote for both just to move these bills out of committee. I think they deserve to be heard more. At the same time, I understand what some folks are saying. People are tired, man. I mean, if there's one thing I try to do in my whole and I've been a state senator, an assemblyman, a mayor, a county commissioner, I try to talk to people. And I know a lot of folks don't do that as much as I do, but I do. Every single day, I call a certain number of people on the phone when they've expressed concerns about things, or talk to them on the street. And I'll tell you what, I'm sure there are many folks that do that, but the bottom line is people are sick to death of it. The institution is broken to some degree. We do have too much debt. We do have too many problems. And yes, we have members, quite frankly, I know you were targeting one in those previous comments, but we have members on both sides of the aisle that have issues. But hopefully that will be taken care of in the voting booth. And in the abstract, the voting booth should take care of everything. And it's interesting that people love their own congressperson, but do not necessarily love the institution. So I'm torn with this issue, because sometimes experience is good. And I've known in every level of government, members that were new to the government that were, quite frankly, horrible. And I've known members that have been there for countless numbers of years that were horrible, and new members that were great, and members that have been there many years that were great as well. So it's not an easy issue, but I do know what we're reacting to. If anybody believes that we are in a time where business as usual can just continue, they are wrong. People are sick to death. They're tired of it. They're tired of more and more of their paycheck going towards taxes. They're tired of the debt that this country has. They're tired of not believing. And, you know, I know everybody says MAGA is a great thing. They like to use that as a detrimental thing. But make America great. America is great. America should be number one. America should be the best and strongest and most focused nation in the world. And people don't feel that way right now. People are suffering through this. They really are. So I think this needs more of an opportunity to be aired. It needs more of an opportunity to be heard. I, quite frankly, haven't made my final decision if it was up to a final vote. But I do tell you, and again, I know I'm emphasizing this, don't think it's just the same old stuff. It isn't. We are coming to a breaking point in this nation, and if we want to stay a republic, I know we always talk about a democracy, and that's important, but we are a republic. And you know, Benjamin Franklin said, I give you a republic if you can keep it. And that's the question. Can we keep it if we just keep doing what we've been doing? We must change.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. And I actually thought about this issue for some time, and I think our founding fathers did too. And they decided not to prescribe term limits because they thought, you know what, American people have a chance and they have an impact. Unfortunately, since founding fathers thought through all of these processes, a lot of negative things happened. They never thought about 16th and 17th Amendment, where now a lot of senators don't even remember where their states are located, or maybe don't have capacity to remember, or how much money is spent now in DC and how much money go in political PACs and how expensive this election became. So I think considering the amount of money that invested in these races, I think have shorter term limits is actually would be better, because that this big special interest group wouldn't be as much interested to spend money, and actually maybe some person, good American with good intent, would be able to win in some of these races. Not only people have that able to raise money and have their own money. I think this has become a huge problem. And don't worry, guys, you're still going to get all your pensions even in 6 years. So you'll be all good, set to go, which is ridiculous that we even have pensions. This is actually a duty, not a, it's a service. It's like a tour of duty. So I think it's good. And another thing I would like to add, honestly, this job is a hard job, and it's meant to be hard. And you know what? The longer you stay here, I think you have the two things. You become part of the swamp, or you completely give up. So I think you have, as a human being, so much time and energy to do. So I think, you learn your first term, you make some move, but you know what? If you cannot accomplish something in 6 years, probably let someone else to try it. Otherwise, we become run here by young kids, and some of them great kids, but you know what? If we run here by 25-year-olds that never had real life, and some people that have been there all their life, that also don't understand what real life is, we're going to be real in trouble, and we are. So I think actually this is something that we have to highly consider. I think fresh ideas, we have many Americans, millions of Americans that could represent here. Fresh ideas, fresh energy, fresh deliberation would be actually very healthy for this institution, that it's not run, it's top-down approach, but not run by big money, but actually we will be represented with the people, and people don't have to worry about as much about the next race, but worry more how we're going to save this republic, because a lot of issues here that we're deliberating shouldn't be a partisan issue, because there are some issues that will be very, disagree very much and debate very, very vibrantly. But there are some issues like national security issues, like border security, that we shouldn't have deliberation. We should actually start governing. So maybe people will not be afraid to stand up against the very powerful money machine and say, you know what? I'll do the right thing regardless of consequences, and we'll save this republic and protect these people. We have many Americans died for our freedoms and have this greatest experiment that ever existed in history of the world. And we have to remember, not just talk about it. I had one of our active military guys send me a very interesting note that he did for memorial service of his fallen brother in Afghanistan. And it was very impactful for me when he said, it's not just words and tributes and all this different presentation we do, but how do we carry on with actions and our flag of freedom and our ideas and ideals forward, and stand up and fight for these issues, and not being afraid. Big money machine pushing on us, status quo pushing on us, being being able to challenge our own party. It's very easy to blame the other side and do presentations and circuses here. Very easy, but actually challenge your own party and say, you know what? My party need to get up and put the money where mouth is, because we're betraying the American people. We're betraying a lot of heroes, and doing a lot of presentation for the social media here, where the country has some serious issues, and we might not agree on all of them, but we can find common ground if we want. So I think this legislation maybe help us to get stronger, grow backbone and stamina, and actually start serving the people that we're meant to be. Because as I said, there is no lobby for the people here. We're the only people lobby for the people. And if we fail, our republic is going to fail. And I'm not ready to give up. So I urge my colleagues to support, but not to oppose this amendment.
Myself for 5 minutes. I confess I'm a reformed drunk on this subject. I was one of just 2 sitting members of the California Assembly to endorse legislative term limits in 1990. They set a 6-year limit on the Assembly, and I supported them for the same reasons we've heard from the advocates today. I genuinely thought it would encourage more goal-oriented membership who are more skeptical of the bureaucracy and were more independent from legislative leaders. I won all of my debates just by saying, whatever the opposition says, just take a look at the California state legislature and tell me, could things possibly get any worse? And we all laughed and we all voted for term limits. And as karma would have it, I left the Assembly in 1992 when the term limits had had no practical effect yet on the membership. And I returned 4 years later when they had had complete and total effect. And the differences that I observed were absolutely jarring. They achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of arriving in the legislature contemplating their political mortality, members simply arrived contemplating their next political move. They had no experience in state government, so they were far more dependent on the bureaucracy. And since their terms were limited, they were far more dependent on the leadership to assist in their next political move. Prior to term limits, members on the committees often had more experience with the subject matter than the bureaucrats who were appearing before them. A term limit stripped the legislative branch of this advantage, and it shifted enormous influence from the elected legislature to the unelected professional bureaucracy. Before term limits, there was a sense of loyalty to the institution and the process. Term limits destroyed all of that. Before term limits, the Assembly had leaders with experience that was commensurate to the Senate, and the Houses were fairly evenly balanced in terms of their influence. The leaders of the Assembly had equal or greater experience as their Senate counterparts. But after term limits, the Senate became the dominant House because that's where all of the experience accumulated. Some say the founders envisioned citizen politicians and term limits will restore that vision. Well, the founders served in many different offices and walks of life, but they were very serious politicians. George Washington won his first political office to the Virginia House of Burgesses at age 26. He left the presidency at 65. That's a career that spanned 39 years. John Adams was first elected as selectman of the town of Braintree, Massachusetts at age 31. He left the presidency in 1801 at age 66. That's career spanned 35 years. Thomas Jefferson was 26 when he was first elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. He left the presidency in 1809 at the age of 64, 38 years. James Madison, first elected to the Virginia legislature when he was 25, left the presidency in 1817 at the age of 66, 41 years. Abraham Lincoln was 25 when he was first elected to the Illinois House of Representatives after he lost his first bid at age 23. He left the presidency at 1865 at age 56, total career 31 years. So I pose this question. Would the country have been better off if we had curtailed these professional politicians just when they were acquiring the wisdom and judgment and experience to guide our nation through times of strife and peril? Term limit advocates dwell on the advantages of incumbency. Incumbents do have an advantage over challengers because they've already been through the vetting process with their constituents. They've generally acquired a greater experience in the subjects that they've dealt with, and they've built a record that people can judge. The founders did limit terms in a way. They limited the House to 2-year terms to assure that by definition, the House was constantly representative of the people. And I'd argue those are all good things that we should encourage. If my conservative colleagues who mistakenly believe that term limits will improve the legislative branch, please look to states like California that succumbed to that siren song and ask yourself if you really want to send the Congress in that direction. Please look to the debate over this very issue at the Constitutional Convention and understand the reason these wise men rejected the idea. They did so, according to Madison's notes, principally for the reason the ranking member mentioned, that as term limits approached, they were afraid members would consider less and less the public interest and more their own. That's just human nature. In short, we have based our entire form of government on the assumption that more than half the people are right more than half of the time. That's a sound assumption. Let's stick to it and let us trust the people. I yield back.